Good morning. I may disappoint you a bit today because I don't intend to give you a technical brief. I'll rather talk in more contextual terms. But I think that the GEOINT community, which you represent, is one important actor to provide tools and solutions to the challenges that we see in our contemporary times and also in the future. As I was introduced, I am the senior national representative from Sweden, but also the chairman of the international coalition here at CENTCOM. However, today I choose not to speak in the capacity of either of those. I'd rather give you some personal observations, of course, based on the work that I do. First of all, something about perspectives. It's really important to understand that we see the world in different ways, depending on from where we come. Perspectives are based by many things. They are based on history, geography, interest, honor, fear, culture, religion, and our leaders. I would like to mention some defining factors on which the Swedish perspective is based. One is geography. We're, of course, a small country which has a long land way to reach Europe, which has always been a defining factor for us. In the early days, we had the Vikings, who, in contrary to the Norwegian and Danish Vikings, took their course to the east, and they traveled down the rivers of today's Russia all the way down to the Black Sea. In the 1500s, we fought a war against the Catholics in Europe. Our king, Gustavus Adolphus, was a Protestant, and he wanted to salvage the poor Europeans from that faith. And then in the 16 and 1700s, we fought many wars with Russia, and finally we lost Finland to Russia in 1809. And this is something that has really shaped our perception of Russia, and still do, I would say. During the 1930s, we had an incident where the government used military troops to put down a strike, where several of the striking workers were killed. And this is still influencing the public debate in Sweden on how to use military in support of civil society. We did not participate in any of the world wars. We sent about 10,000 volunteers to help Finland, but other than that, we were spared from both wars. And we have developed a taste for the United Nations as the tool for conflict resolutions. And in modern times, if the 60s and ahead could be called that, we have been very active in the UN, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the 9/11 attack, we've been mostly engaged in NATO and other coalition-led operations. So in conclusion, our perspective is based on military non-alignment as a tool for success. We used to have a very large defense force. Actually, in the 50s, we had the fourth largest air force in the world. Now we have a very modest defense force of about 50,000 people. And we've had 200 years of peace, where we, in many aspects, withdrew from European interaction, formed on a belief in non-alignment as the universal recipe to stay out of conflicts. Our EU membership was domestically hard-won, but we finally joined the EU, and in the EU we have always linked up with the United Kingdom, who now is leaving, so that leaves us in a special position there as well. Russia, as I said, is seen as the main threat, and as a small state we have developed a strong belief and hope in the UN as the tool for solving most issues on the global arena. And we have certainly invested in the idea of eternal peace and the rule of law since the end of the Cold War. So this is how we Swedes, in many ways, is viewing the world. Let me talk about two of the main threats that I see today and the forecast for tomorrow, and what consequences they may bring for a small state like Sweden, and they would also indicate what kind of support and tools we would need from a community that you represent. First of all, violent extremist organizations. We know that jihadism, which we talk about in this case, and extremist fundamentalism has always been produced by a confluence of factors. Enabling conditions for fundamentalism are such as frail states, socio-economic factors, a youth bulge in combination with unemployment, ideological upheaval, societal rifts, technological development, and also foreign intervention. Sweden has for years had a very liberal immigration policy, and in combination with a generous social welfare system, this attracted many refugees from the conflicts in the Middle East and partly also from poor countries in Africa. In terms of asylum seekers, we received almost 300,000 during a period of 4 years. That should be set in relation to a population of less than 10 million. In military terms, we often talk about the operational depth, in which you can absorb an attack and create room for maneuver. This could easily translate to a similar term in terms of the demography, the demographic depth, where a population-wise small country will have problems to absorb and integrate such a big influx of predominantly young males with a low level of education. We can already now see our society and the welfare state struggle under this burden, because the Swedish society is built on the concept of most citizens being productive and paying into the common funds through their taxes. A failure to integrate large parts of the immigrants in our society carries big risks. And today we see the police struggling to uphold law and order in several immigrant areas in our bigger cities. Furthermore, the prospects for the future for many of these new arrivals are poor. In this group, we have an unemployment rate between 20 and 30%, compared to around 3% for native Swedes. So in short, we may have created the facilitating factors for extremism and civil unrest ourselves. According to our Swedish security services, we have more than 3,000 potentially violent extremist terrorists in the country today, of which roughly 300 are estimated to be downrange in the Middle East. We have only experienced 4 terrorist incidents since the 1970s. 2 in the 70s, an embassy hostage-taking and an airplane hijacking. In 2010, a failed suicide bombing in Stockholm, and about a year ago, which you can see on this picture, a truck stolen by an illegal Uzbek immigrant mowing down people on a busy shopping street in Stockholm. 5 killed and 15 wounded. A pattern we have seen from many cities around the world, US included. The latter was a true wake-up call in which, in many ways, made also Swedes realize that no country is exempted from the effects of violent terror extremism. So what does that mean for us? As we see an increase in terrorist attacks against soft targets all over the world, we shall not exclude the possibility that our military in an increased manner needs to support the police and other civilian agencies. We know that the police is already stretched to the limits, and we may end up doing what the French and Belgian military has been doing for several years now domestically, which is extremely resource demanding. So we need to develop assets to conduct cost-effective surveillance of these individuals. As we all know, it's very resource demanding to follow up on people who we suspect of being dangerous to our society. The interagency cooperation and coordination needs to develop further in order to detect and fight potential threats. Intelligence and information sharing between different agencies is something that modern democracies, for good reasons, have abstained from or regulated very hard in the interest of personal integrity. Furthermore, since terrorism is a transnational issue, the increased intelligence cooperation between countries is vital. In the cyber arena, we need to deny the terrorists the domination and utilization of this arena. As little as we should allow a Salafist caliphate to exist, we should allow a virtual caliphate. In our specific case, this will mean that we need to empower some agencies, for instance, our equivalent, however slightly more modest than the US NSA, further. Another sensitive topic, but one that we no longer can abstain from addressing. This can be done, in my opinion, in a reasonable and controlled way, but the integrity of extremists should no longer have primacy, and they shall not be allowed to own the narrative here. We also need to prevent the extremists to inspire and radicalize the large and often silent majority of Muslims, those who do not believe in this violent and extreme form of their religion, the non-believers. To do this is no easy task, and I'm afraid that our societies need to engage in something close to psychological operations, which of course is a very touchy subject. Their message should be countered by active propaganda, depicting them as the cowards and criminals they are. And it's really important to understand that the fight against jihadists can't be won without the active support of the non-believers and the passive observers within the Muslim community. In terms of developing technology, the terrorists have been very good at staying on top of this. And in addition to the rather successful utilization of social media and internet by ISIS, there are other technological threats. The terrorist use of over-the-shelf drones is becoming very frequent, and the capabilities are developing quickly. On the battlefield, this is one thing, more of a tactical nuisance, but just imagine what a swarm of drones could do to civilian airliners landing or taking off from an airport, or to big crowds in a sports event. So developing counter-drone measures and putting legislation into place to regulate the use of drones and how they can be operated is one thing that is important. We see, lastly, that the immigration question is creating fertile ground for nationalistic and to some degree fascist parties who in many countries have created a deep political polarization. Not to mention the polarization between the European Union countries. All this plays well into the hands of the other, perhaps I should say the primary threat that Sweden sees to its security, namely the development of Russia into becoming once again an aggressive and unpredictable neighbor. The Saturday morning ride. The Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine and Crimea in 2014, and its involvement in Syria have highlighted that Russia has capacity and intent to use all its instruments of power to re-enter the global center stage. The former Soviet republics, our Baltic neighbors, today members of NATO, are perceiving an increasing military threat. Russia's military actions in combination with an ever more aggressive rhetoric is what is forming this perception. As a reaction to the Russian posture, NATO has since some time pre-positioned troops in the area, in the Baltics, in Poland, and also in Germany. Both the Baltic Sea area and the Arctic are border areas between Western interest areas and Russian areas of interest. The increased military presence and activity in these areas means that the risk for military incidents and confrontation has increased dramatically. As an expression of its reborn superpower ambitions, Russia is interpreting its areas of interest to stretch beyond its actual borders, and it expects other countries to respect that position. This effectively means that Russia has to strive to change the collective security order and emphasize the exclusive position of the superpowers. We assess that even if Russia is militarily inferior to NATO and the US, it has the capacity for temporary and regional superiority due to the need for NATO to bring in reinforcements from continental US to be able to confront Russian aggression. In addition to the development of new high-tech weapons, the Russians have worked hard on their capabilities to command and control coordinated operations using all their instruments of power, in the information arena as well as in the physical world, all aiming at achieving their strategic goals with a minimum level of resistance from an opponent and minimal risk for themselves. Almost daily, countries in the Western Hemisphere are experiencing signs of their capacity in the cyber as well as in the information arena. We perceive the Russian perception of the world to be ultra-realist. According to this view, Russia perceives the world today first and foremost as an alien and often hostile place in which the strong prosper and the weak get beaten. They also live by the primacy of hard power. Smaller states and multilateral organizations are seen as objects or instruments of great power diplomacy rather than serious actors with proper agendas. The national security strategy that Russia has presented openly challenges the Euro-Atlantic security order, for instance by saying that the growing refugee flows from Africa and the Middle East to Europe have made it evident that regional security systems in the Euro-Atlantic region built on NATO and the EU as the basis are unsustainable. There is also evidence of a widespread hostility towards the West in Russian society, as well as a readiness to put military needs before economic growth if needed. We all know that the Russian economy is struggling due to the low oil prices and the sanctions that the West has put on them. Russian security policy mainly rests on two pillars: the possession of nuclear weapons and the permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. The nuclear weapons have become ever more important, and the nuclear rhetoric has reached unprecedented heights. Clearly, there is a political determination of the Russian leadership to use nuclear weapons as a primary tool for foreign policy coercion. A worrying and frightening debate is ongoing in Russian military newspapers and journals regarding the use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate a conflict. Nuclear de-escalation means the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons when a local war is escalating into a regional war to scare the opponent. The priorities set out for foreign policy suggest in which geographical areas Russia thinks it's most likely that future military conflicts could erupt. Russia has explicitly pointed out the establishment of regimes hostile to itself in its neighborhood as a danger. This suggests that an immediate focus will continue to be on the countries neighboring on Russia, not least the former Soviet republics, which of course is our Baltic neighbors. So in short, the evolution of Russia under Putin has meant military reform and the acquisition of technologically well-developed weapons, an expansionist and aggressive foreign policy, a military doctrine which openly talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, increased skills in the soft power end of the hybrid warfare scale, and the active means to break down the international order. So, finally, summary and conclusions for Sweden. In strategic terms, we don't perceive Swedish territory as being an isolated and primary goal for any Russian aggression. However, Swedish territory would play an important role for both parties, NATO and Russia, in case of a conflict in the Baltic Sea area. Seen from a Swedish perspective, such a conflict would most likely emanate from Russian aggression towards the Baltic states. We are therefore rebuilding our capacity for homeland defense and will most likely develop and acquire weapon systems, enabling us to fight at a greater strategic and operational depth than has been the traditional Swedish concept. Adequate intelligence and an awareness of what is ongoing in our near abroad is of course of crucial or vital interest to us, and especially since we as a small state always will be reactive rather than proactive. As we almost daily see proof of hybrid threats, such as attacks on the cyber and information arenas, including infrastructure disturbance, influence operations through proxies, trolls, and soft power tools, we are taking measures to increase the resilience of society and our capacity to resist and counter these attacks. In parallel, we are strengthening our readiness to withstand a serious crisis in terms of keeping reserves of strategic commodities, something that we put aside when the wall came down. Sweden, being a small state, is terrified by the notion of a breakdown of the international order and the development into a Hobbesian world, where the strong set the order and the weak have to comply. The international organizations, EU, NATO, and UN, are critical for us and other smaller actors in the world. In addition, we are trying to create strategic alliances on a bilateral basis rather than applying for membership in NATO, which would seem a logical conclusion in relation to the developments in our part of the world. The terrorism and the refugee crisis and its effect on the European countries in terms of financial pressure, political fragmentation, and societal degradation is a dangerous development in many countries. It facilitates the growth of nationalist parties and creates rifts in the European Union. Domestically, we can see that there is a resource conflict between necessary improvements of internal and external security and the growing demand in the welfare sector. Failure to succeed to integrate the immigrants may lead to civil unrest, extremism, and open conflicts in the country. This, as well as the colliding interests of the NATO allies, Turkey and the US, plays well into the Russian interests. The need to develop adapted legislation and measures to counter the threat from terrorism are also forcing many countries to walk the tightrope between weighing security versus personal integrity and the basic democratic rights for its citizens. So in conclusion, a world full of challenges threatening to shake up even a country which for 2 centuries has developed a belief that it would forever be untouched by the evils of the world. And that concludes my briefing.
Thank you very much. And if you'd like to move over here, I'll ask you some questions. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I think what you reinforced, at least for me, was for perspectives. It's all a matter of where you stand, where you sit, or in your case, the geography. Okay, so it really is important about your perceptions. With the UK and Brexit and the future of the EU, talk about the future of the EU. Is that going to be what in 5 years, will it be what we see today, or what do you think? How do you think it will change?
I think there are many factors playing into this. We still don't see the effects of the British withdrawal from the European Union, and we don't have a new agreement in place. In many ways, when it comes to military operations in the EU or conflict resolution operations, the Brits have always seen NATO as the tool that should be used for all European conflict management. So they have been a little bit against the current, so to speak. So I see that France and Germany as the now 2 main actors. The political developments in their countries will be of vital importance in which way the EU will develop. As I said, the refugee crisis has put a lot of strain on the European Union, and we can see a clear rift with the position of some of the former Eastern European countries on immigration and some of the more northwestern European countries as well. So I think EU has many, many challenges, but there is also a lot of potential in the organization. And for smaller countries, personally, I think that cooperation and being part of a community like that gets us much stronger.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned also the prospects of Sweden joining NATO possibly. Is that something you see in the cards in the future?
Well, we now have 4 of our 8 parliament parties which has decided to put NATO membership on their political agenda. And this, personally, I think that there are some hidden things in this. I talked about Gustavus Adolphus fighting a war against the Catholics in the 1500s. Some things in our skepticism towards continental Europe is reflected all the way back to that time, I think.
Okay. Now, certainly in your current position at CENTCOM, but how do you feel intelligence sharing can be improved to enable partnerships? Do you see that we're doing a good job sharing intelligence today, or are there areas for improvement that strike you?
Intelligence sharing is, of course, a very sensitive topic, and we will all by default put Swedish eyes only, US eyes only on any document, because then we are sure we are not making a mistake. However, it all comes down to the building of trust between different parties. It comes down to looking at what effect intelligence sharing may bring downrange, because that's what it's all about. But we also have technical challenges in terms of having systems that can interact with each other.
Could you describe just briefly the coalition efforts here inside of CENTCOM? Or are there regular meetings? Is everybody getting along? Is everybody facilitating things? Is this a good environment? We heard from the previous speaker about the coalition may change over the future and alliances may change. Are we on the right path, do you think?
I definitely think so. I think fighting violent extremist organizations cannot be done by one country alone or individually. We need to stick together. We are presently 48 countries physically represented here in Tampa today. We are liaison officers, so we are not actively involved in the operational planning. We have a small staff element that is interacting with the CENTCOM planning to bring in the multinational and the coalition view on the operational planning. But so we, on a daily basis, we are briefed by US CENTCOM on what's ongoing downrange, and we do teleconferences with the CJTF staff downrange as well. So.
Okay. Now, and we've seen a lot, talking about Russia reinventing themselves in some way, or reemerging as they certainly want to reassert their power. But when we've seen a lot on the news about ships or airplanes or submarines or surface ships and submarines violating national space or sovereign space, whether it's be airspace or inside of territorial water limits. Are you facing a lot of that as well, or are you having to deal with that inside of the area where you are? You're pretty well protected or bounded.
You mean in Sweden?
Yes.
Yeah. No, we see a lot of, actually we had, I think about 4 years ago, we had a simulated attack where the Russians flew almost all the way to their target area, and then they turned around. We have seen when we have exercised together with the US that their flying is very aggressive and almost dangerous in terms of being close to your ships and your aircraft as well as ours, of course. So we see a new posture from the Russians.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we have time for one more question. I think almost every country is dealing with the asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants. And in most parts, large numbers will come in, and most people are truly seeking asylum or a better way of life. But then there's always the bad actors. The bad actors are 1% or 5% of a group that might come across. And yet they are the ones that cause the real problems and the real concerns. Have you guys got a policy for identifying and dealing with those individuals, or everybody seems to be struggling with what do we do?
I think the biggest struggle is that we have had such a big influx during a very short time, and not many countries had structures in place to address this and deal with it. So in that sense, some bad guys, of course, have come through the net, and which is bad. But I mean, the great majority are people that are seeking peace and somewhere to not be shot at. So.
Absolutely. All right, please join me in a big round of applause for Brigadier General Elis Arms.